Hello, Buzzkillers. It's the old professor here, and I'm getting older and older as time goes on. I suppose that's happening to most people. But what we really like to talk about in history is when we're sort of alone with ourselves, when we're with other experts, we often talk about what if and counterfactuals and what have happened. And very rarely is it the case that you can find books or find examples where we sort of know what might have happened if things have gone slightly differently. And that's the reason why we have on the line Jeff Nussbaum, who's just written and published a very, very important book called Undelivered, the Never Heard Speeches That Would Have Rewritten History. Thanks so much for coming on.
Such a pleasure to be with you.
Well, again, like I say, this is so important because often these things are lost to history. We don't know what someone would have said if things or would have turned out differently. And we also often don't know what they planned to say, and then things got changed by other people, which is so frequently the case. Can you give us a sort of overview of the book and the approach and why choose this thing of stuff that technically didn't happen, at least didn't happen in terms of the public presentation of a speech?
Of course. And I'll start by saying that I was at a gathering of history teachers, and someone asked almost accusingly, "Are you worried that you're writing a counterfactual history?" And it never occurred to me to worry that I was writing a counterfactual history, which kind of delves into the realm of fiction and wish fulfillment and things like that, because I'm not really playing out a counterfactual. I'm showing with these speeches the first steps down an alternate path. And it's not made up first steps, it's first steps that were really drafted. And the bar for inclusion in the book Undelivered was this a speech that the leader engaged with? People have said, why don't you have Nixon's moon landing failure speech? And it's because there's no evidence Nixon ever saw it. So part of what I love about this is I'm not playing out an entire counterfactual history, but I am showing that things didn't have to happen the way they happened, that there could have been an alternate outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And leaders and speakers prepared for some of those alternate outcomes. And so rather than taking us down an alternate road, I showed a couple steps down that road might have looked like. As to your question about where the obsession came from, I'm a speechwriter, I'm a professional speechwriter. So I've had lots of speeches end up on the cutting room floor for lots of reasons that are unimportant. But sometimes speeches don't get delivered for reasons that are very important. And that's what I pulled for the book.
Well, I didn't say the word. I don't think I used the word obsession, because I think the focus is so good and is so important, and I don't think of it as a counterfactual at least in the popular sense of the term counterfactual, because the drafts of what people wrote, were part of history, that they did happen. And I'd like to start off by looking at the very first speech that you put in the book in part one. Words That Are Too Hot is the title for the part. And this is the famous John Lewis speech on the March on Washington, August 1963. And this is absolutely fascinating for lots of reasons. The drafting of the speech, what Lewis wants to say, what eventually he's able to say. And let me just nerd out for a little bit, Buzzkillers, because what Jeff has put in this chapter is a nice table that has both a column of the original draft and then the column of the actual speech. And the interplay between those things is fascinating. So please, before I rush ahead and tell the story myself, which I'm dying to do, I want the expert to tell the story. So please enlighten the Buzzkillers about what happened.
Sure. So this is the March on Washington, the famous march at which Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech, which wasn't actually the speech King wanted to give either.
Mm-hmm.
But Lewis was an interesting character in this drama because he didn't actually want to speak at the march. He felt that the march had become too corporate, too establishment. In his words, I didn't want it to be a march in Washington. I wanted it to be a march on Washington. And he was the young leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is called SNCC. And this was really the activist youth, in the fight arm of the civil rights movement. And Lewis was their new young leader. And so his advisors convinced him to speak at the march because it was going to be so public and so present. And Lewis said, okay, I'll do it. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to put some sting into it. And that's what he set out to do in the drafting, was to really bring the voice of someone who had been, as he had been, on the freedom rides, who had been beaten, who had seen, that the fight for civil rights was that it was a fight.
But you, as you quite rightly point out, he sort of he drafts a speech, but and then shows it to the important people involved, not only in SNCC but in the march as a whole. But it's not just a case of them saying, no, 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 there's too much sting in this, and you have to water it down. And the final version is a very watered down version. You show how it's much more complex than that. What happened was much more complex than that.
It was, in fact, because there's a delicate thing going on here, which is the march. They're trying to keep all these different organizations together. NAACP, labor. They're trying to keep Kennedy's seal of approval on the march, which was very important.
Yeah.
And Kennedy's seal of approval, and in a game of kind of dominoes, depended a little bit on the Archbishop of Washington, a guy named Patrick O'Boyle's seal of approval. He was planning on delivering the invocation at the march. And O'Boyle was a progressive guy. He had helped to desegregate Washington's Catholic schools. And yet, in Lewis's draft, he says lots of things that are very strong, too strong in retrospect. But one of them is he basically says, to those who counsel patience, let me say patience is a dirty and nasty word.
Yeah, right.
And what happens the night before the march is that the people close to Lewis see the other speakers putting their speeches out for the press in order to get some extra press coverage. So Lewis's folks put out Lewis's speech. And when people see what he wants to say, it becomes a problem. And all of a sudden, Lewis is the young guy who's being too incendiary, and everyone wants to start editing his speech. O'Boyle says he won't deliver the invocation if Lewis continues with this line about patience being a dirty and nasty word. So Lewis actually, just with the words he wanted to say, is potentially throwing a wrench into this really well orchestrated event. And so everyone starts coming down on him to change things that he wanted to say. Like, he wants to say, we cannot support wholeheartedly the administration's civil rights bill, for it is too little and too late. Right? That's a shot across Kennedy's bow.
Sure.
That you're giving us too little and too late of a civil rights bill. He wants to say, we won't confine our marching to Washington. We'll march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did. We'll pursue our own scorched earth policy and burn Jim Crow to the ground nonviolently. So really, really tough language, really, 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 really pushing the comfort zone. And part of why, as a speechwriter, I led with this chapter is the goal of a speech is to persuade. And are there moments where you can push your audience too far so that instead of bringing them with you, you push them away? And that was the fear on the part of the organizers, that Lewis wouldn't actually bring people with him with the speech. He would push them away.
So does this? I know what happened because I read the book and read the chapter. But please tell the Buzzkillers, does this work? Does Lewis back down? How does he adjust his speech to become different?
Right. So now the march is actually happening, and Lewis has agreed to some minor concessions, but people want more. And I found in the archives this wonderful image that is published in the book, I think for the first time, where it's Lewis has retreated to the back of the Lincoln Memorial, and he's kind of under the arm of Abraham Lincoln with Jim Foreman and Cortlandt Cox and Mildred Foreman, because what has happened is everyone basically is taking their turns trying to get him to tone down his speech, including Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King says to him, John, this doesn't sound like you. And Lewis doesn't want to change it. He says, yeah, but Martin, it sounds like us. It sounds like the youth movement. And finally, what happens is the organizer of the whole thing, the kind of the grandfather of the whole operation, A. Philip Randolph, begs him. Lewis describes it this way. He says, Randolph turned to me. John, he said, he looked as if he might cry. We've come this far together. Let us stay together. And then Lewis later said, this was as close to a plea as a man as dignified as he could come. How could I say no? It would be like saying no to Mother Teresa. So he does make changes. He does make some really substantial edits. And that's what I show in the book. And at the end of it, Lewis is frustrated. He does it. He's frustrated. He feels like he's taken the edge off. And yet, the New York Times reported the next day that it was the angriest speech of all of the speeches. And so one of the things I talk about when I talk about speech writing is the audience doesn't hear what you wanted to say. They hear how you say what you did say. And so even though Lewis takes out lines like, this nation is still a place of cheap political leaders. He takes out lines like, the revolution is at hand. He takes out lines like, we all recognize the fact that if radical social and political and economic changes are to take place in our society, the masses must bring them about. So even though he's taken that all out, it still is perceived as this really interesting yin and yang between Lewis and King, where Lewis really reveals a lot about the nightmare, and then King answers with the dream.
We should remind Buzzkillers that A. Philip Randolph was a very early leader in civil rights. We've done a show on him several years ago. To have A. Philip Randolph, who must have been, Lord, he must have been pushing 80 at the time,
Yeah.
come up to you and say, look, you need to change. This is like, I don't know, I can imagine this is what, it's like almost a religious figure, because in 1963, A. Philip Randolph himself is historic.
That's right. Right. We think of the civil rights leaders whose names we know as kind of the initial generation,
Yeah.
but they're really the Joshua generation. It's the A. Philip Randolph and kind of the civil rights plus labor rights fights earlier on that led to this, and that's why this march was such a big deal for Randolph.
And Buzzkillers, I can't stress enough. Please go to I know you've got the book in front of you because you've got it on. We have it on the bookshelf, on the Buzzkill bookshelf, and I hope you order it right away. But please go to pages 30 and following, and look at the comparison side by side of the draft and the delivered speech. And what I want to suggest is, yes, of course, as you say, a lot of this very, very strong language and very, very strong and biting words are taken out, but also what's put in. And you put these things you put in bold, which fascinate me so much, is it becomes more individual and personal in the delivered speech. So, for instance, the draft speech it talks kind of vaguely about people working under very difficult conditions and being oppressed. But in the published speech, he talks specifically, while we stand here, there are sharecroppers in the Delta of Mississippi who are in the fields working for $3 a day, 12 hours a day. While we stand there are students in jail on trumped-up charges. And it says our brother James Farmer, along with many others, is in jail. A lot of the stuff that's to the sting that's taken out of the draft seems to me anyway to be replaced by specific instances of oppression, and that's a different type of strength, but it's very, very strong as well.
That's right. You identified it exactly right, which is a lot of this sort of blanket language that was so off-putting to so many folks gets replaced with undeniable specifics. And yet, I argue in speeches, the specifics are actually where the power really lies, because he lays out the injustice. The other thing I will say is he gives himself a little room to maneuver, right? So he deletes, we can't support this civil rights bill, and he changes it to, it's true that we support the administration's civil rights bill. We support it with great reservation, however, and then he outlines things that should go into the bill. So as opposed to making blanket declarative statements, he's giving himself a little room to negotiate, which I would argue is, one of the things that you start to see as activists mature into leaders.
Well, how does this sort of play with the leaders of the march, with Martin Luther King? How are they satisfied with his changes? Do they see this speech as being strong in the end? Are they relieved? Are they what reaction do they have to him agreeing to certain numbers of edits and the types of edits he makes?
Even though Lewis is frantically making edits up to the last minute, the leaders are still a little nervous, because when they introduce him, they say, "Ladies and gentlemen, young John Lewis," as if to basically say, "Hey, he's young, so whatever's coming next, we'll see." Ultimately, folks were okay with it. Obviously, it got a huge reaction from the crowd. But yeah, it was a unique speech on the march, right? The march was conciliatory. It was very kumbaya. Even though, by the way, the city in preparation for the march was braced for war. I mean,
yeah.
Liquor licenses were suspended. The Senators, the baseball team, had canceled their home games. The National Guard was called up. Police forces and firefighters from Maryland and Virginia were deputized. I mean, it is amazing that this peaceful march, which remained peaceful and was peaceful, the city prepared for war. And we have a kind of a current counterpoint where on January 6th,
Yeah.
War was brought to Washington, and the city was not prepared for that. But it is a good reminder of how delicate this thing was and why there was such a response to what Lewis might have said.
Yeah, see, I was prepared for this speech to have been to compare when comparing the draft with the delivered speech, for it to be a back down, for it to be a watered down, and things like that. But he still, as we talked about before, he still uses the phrase police state for a particular place in Virginia. He still talks about again these specifics that we mentioned. He says we are beat up by policemen. We're tired of seeing people locked up in jail, and how long must we be patient? There is a good deal of calcium in this backbone.
Absolutely. It is urgent. Although you mentioned police state, and that's one of the most interesting one-word changes in the whole speech, because he talks about who must live in fear of a police state. And his
Yeah.
initial draft says live in fear in a police state.
Oh,
And
yeah, sorry, that's right.
and,
Yeah.
and so I find it so fascinating, right? Like if you're living in a police state, you're describing something that is real and present in your life. If you're saying of a police state, you're saying something that could happen. And so I've spent a long time going down this rabbit hole of like, why that one word change? It's interesting. How does that change meaning? But you're exactly right. This absolutely is still strong. He takes away, we're going to march through the heart of Dixie the way Sherman did. But he does say we will march through the South, through Danville, through Cambridge, which is Cambridge, Maryland, not Massachusetts, through the streets of Birmingham. We'll march with the spirit of love and dignity that we've shown here today. So he doesn't give up on the marching and fighting and taking this to the hot spots. But yeah, so indeed, it is strong. And later in life, Lewis said, I think I probably did the right thing to tone it down the way I did.
I was about to ask you that because as we know, as many buzzkillers know, but although we have a lot of buzzkillers in other parts of the world, John Lewis goes on to become an extremely important and influential leader, but also congressman and things like that. He doesn't continue, or he isn't sort of shunned because he's radical for the rest of his life. He becomes extremely productive, and I wonder if, again, we're sort of asking what if he might have thought that toning down that speech and also other instances where he had done similar things helped shape the trajectory of his political career, the way he handled things later on in his career.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly never gave up moral sacred ground, but in Congress, he was able to find common ground. He was not an absolutist all the time. So I do think it's an interesting journey that he went on.
Well, let's skip to a different country and
Sure.
to a sort of go back 30 years to 1936. King Edward VIII's refusal to abdicate the throne initially, but then having to eventually abdicate the throne and write his speech. And I found this chapter so fascinating. This is chapter 6, because, of course, we don't have as much direct record of what happened and what didn't happen in terms of drafts as we did with John Lewis. But we have an awful lot of people talking about what happened, Churchill and other people involved in this decision about what to say over the BBC. So please, again, before I start trammeling off and telling the story myself, please tell us what happens.
Sure. And, people who've watched the show The Crown will have an inkling of this, but this is King Edward. He ascends to the throne on the death of his father, who's George V. And it's very clear immediately that he's not really fit to be king.
Yeah.
The private secretary basically said about him, and I'm quoting, "The best thing that could happen to him, to the country, would be for him to break his neck." His father, King George V, said, quote, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. And then shortly before his death, King George went further. "I pray to God that my eldest son, Edward, will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie, who is Albert, who became King George VI, and Elizabeth, the recently deceased queen, and the throne."
Mm-hmm.
And so what was the concern? Why was he unfit? Really two reasons. One is that he was indiscreet, playboy, childish. He had carried on an affair with a French prostitute during World War I, and she kept their letters. And so later, when she was arrested for murder, she sort of bartered the letters for her freedom. And then the other was his willingness to get directly involved in politics, and his political leanings. In 1935, while speaking to the British Legion, he talked about we should send a delegation of members to Germany to stretch forth the hand of friendship. And so he had these very pro-German sympathies, and he was indiscreet. And so he becomes king in 1936 and basically is carrying on an affair with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee who is not suitable to be queen. And he keeps on with the affair. And an interesting thing happened, which is that they traveled together. The American papers knew all about this and covered it. The British papers, as was characteristic of the time, didn't cover it. So the British people knew nothing of this. People around the world knew a lot of it. And it was all very untoward because she wasn't even fully divorced yet. She gets divorced, and he basically says, I want to marry this woman. And, the prime minister, Stanley Baldwin, others say, you can't.
Yeah.
Like, you can't do this. This is Britain won't accept this woman as a queen. She's not a suitable match. And so the king is now in this crisis, and he doesn't quite know what to do. And he reaches out. He tries a bunch of different angles. He tries proposing a morganatic marriage, which is sometimes called a left-handed marriage, where it's people of unequal social rank and their children have no standing, but that doesn't seem to work. He asks Churchill, interestingly. So this is where a bit more drama comes in, which is Winston Churchill at that point was out of power. He does not like Stanley Baldwin. He calls the prime minister a walking corpse, among other things. And so Churchill's wife later says, may have been the last believer in the divine right of kings. Churchill likes Edward and thinks, maybe I can help him. And maybe in helping him, I can divide the parliament into a king's party and an anti-king's party, and I can ride the king's party back to power. So Churchill has an angle, although it's a little unclear where his fingerprints are. Baldwin really just wants to get the king out, which is what many people who knew him wanted as well.
But by the way, all the sensible people at the time argued this was another example of Churchill's bad judgment, and all historians think the same thing now. Churchill had a string of terrible judgmental had a string of making terrible judgments about things up until 1939, frankly.
Yeah, and the irony is, if Churchill had succeeded in this maneuver, he may have become prime minister and had to deal with a king who was not just a Nazi sympathizer, but basically a Nazi and quite willing to help Germany.
Yeah, awful.
And but Churchill advises the king to make a play for time. Churchill tries to argue that in the parliament. He gets shouted down. It ultimately becomes clear that the king has to abdicate, except prior to that, when Churchill is making this play for time, the king asks Sir Walter Monckton, who was kind of his abdication advisor, and potentially Churchill, although the fingerprints are not clear, to help him make a plea to the British people, to give a non-abdication speech, to basically say, as your king, and the speech itself is lovely, but a little sad, because he basically says, why should you all have this one thing that I don't have access to, which is a happy partnership? But the king basically wants to say, you know what, British people, it's your choice. I'm going to go away for a little while, but I leave it to you. Should I stay or should I go? And that's a little bit of a dangerous maneuver, because the king was popular.
Yeah.
And so, he may have been able to hold on to the throne and really, really force a schism. So the speech, it's not exactly clear who wrote it, but it's really quite fascinating. And while I have the text in the book, I can't even have the images of it. I found it in Sir Walter Monckton's archives, because the speech itself, the images remain under the Crown copyright.
Right.
Because it's potentially embarrassing to the Crown. But what happens is at the 11th hour, the king basically says, I'm done. I can't fight this anymore. I'm out. But not before there's some confusion as to what speech he wants to give. And so leading right up to this, the prime minister and others call the head of the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, say, if the king shows up at your studios to give a speech, don't let him on the air.
Right.
So it's not until after he abdicated that the king is allowed to give his speech of explanation.
After he's officially abdicated, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. The abdication speech isn't the and the abdication speech, as you quite rightly point out, is very short and very, it's not talking about all these things that he wanted to say in the "Should I abdicate" speech.
Oh yeah, quite dramatically. And the one thing I end the chapter, in 1940, right, the Battle of Britain is raging, and Churchill gives a famous speech where he describes the heroics of the, quote, unknown warriors where he describes them as vast numbers, not only on this island, in every land, who will render faithful service in the war, but whose names will never be known, whose deeds will never be recorded. This is a war of unknown warriors. And at the end of the chapter, I'd basically say the much maligned prime minister, Stanley Baldwin, enforcing Edward's abdication, deserves credit as one of those unknown warriors, because Edward abdicates and he's in France. His first visit is effectively a state visit to Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
He meets with Hitler. He delivers the Nazi salute. He speaks in German with the folks there.
Yes, it's all shocking.
And throughout the war, early on, he starts to say, he sends telegrams to the Nazi leaders saying, like, a little more bombing will make Britain ready for peace. So Churchill ultimately has to exile him, to the Caribbean to get him away from Germany, because he was a threat. And there was some thinking that if Germany succeeded in enforcing Britain's surrender, they would reinstall Edward as kind of the puppet king.
Well, man, thank God none of that happened. This is a very good time for us to take a little sponsorship break, so we will do that, and we'll be back in a moment with Jeff Nussbaum to talk about one of the most interesting, in fact, maybe the most interesting non-speeches ever given. Back in a second, Buzzkillers. Okay, we're back, Buzzkillers, with Jeff Nussbaum, the author of the great new book, Undelivered, which is about speeches that weren't drafts of speeches that weren't delivered, way speeches have been changed before they get delivered. And, I think one of the most gripping speeches in the book that you talk about is Dwight Eisenhower's apology for the failure of the D-Day invasion, June 1944. The draft of a speech he drafts in case D-Day doesn't work. And, of course, we have such triumphalism about D-Day and triumphalism about the victory in Europe and almost the belief in the inevitability of that this chapter really brings home the fact that, this might not have worked. And, hundreds of thousands of people might have died, and the course of modern history would have been drastically changed. I assume that's why you chose it as one of the important non-delivered speeches in the book, but please tell us why. Please tell us the story before I've talked too much.
Yeah, no, of course. People sometimes ask me which speeches in the book, if delivered, would have indicated like history being changed in dramatic ways. And of course, in the book, I have John F. Kennedy announcing airstrikes on Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He prepared a speech for that. And obviously, if there had been a nuclear exchange, that would have rewritten world history or ended world history. But Eisenhower on the D-Day invasion, I included for several reasons. One is, of course, its historical import. The second is really what it says about the language of leadership. And we can talk about that in just a second. But the historical import is that D-Day was not a sure thing. 156,000 troops making up the landed force encamped in southern England, and the weather is terrible. Eisenhower was very aware of what had happened at Dunkirk. He writes in his journal, this fear that you could get over 100,000 troops onto the beach, then bad weather comes in and they're just pinned down there to be massacred. So he's very nervous about this. They end up having a very brief window of good weather. He gives the order to go. And one of the things he did almost every time he ordered troops into battle is he imagined the failure, and he wrote an apology for it. And in this case, he dashes it off. He handwrites it. It's just a couple paragraphs. In his haste, he misdates it, July 5th rather than June 5th. And he does a couple interesting things. And this gets to the language of leadership, where he basically, initially when he writes it, he writes, the troops have been withdrawn. And he crosses it out and he writes, I have withdrawn the troops.
Yeah.
And then he underlines, if any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And he underlines mine alone. And I just love it because it is the language of leadership, right? He removes the passive voice. He turns it into active voice. And as I say in the book, I found this great quote from President Grant where he said, I am a verb. Leaders are action takers. And years later, Eisenhower was interviewed and he said, the reason I wrote that is because I wasn't going to hide from this thing. This was I had planned it. I'd put it together. I felt it was right, which by the way, was why I think it's interesting that he apologized for the failure of everything he did, because it was a way of almost testing, was the failure worth the risk for the success? And so he said, I wasn't going to hide from this thing. And so he writes that. Now the invasion goes off. Weeks later, Eisenhower finds this folded up note in his wallet
Yeah, that's right. It
and
could
tosses
have tossed, it
it.
could have been lost.
He
Yeah,
did
yeah,
toss it. He
yeah,
tossed it in the
yeah.
trash. He tossed it in the trash, and his aide Harry Butcher fished it out and said, like, I think this one's a keeper.
Yeah. Well, what's so amazing to me about this is on the show, we like to talk about the importance of de-individualizing major moments in history. Because after all, yes, Eisenhower was the leading planner and everything, and the guy who sort of headed the committee to put all this together. But, there are tons of people involved in this. A lot of anything that might have gone wrong could have been one of their faults or the fault of many of them, or the weather could have made the D-Day not happen. And yet he says, if any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And that to me is an amazingly risky and amazingly strong statement to make because, as I say, one of the things they're worried about, and you put this quite rightly in the chapters, they're terrified about the weather. They're looking at the weather every 30 seconds and the predictions, and it's very dicey whether they're going to go or not. And so, when it's up to meteorology, you really can't blame yourself.
Right. There are a million different excuses he could make. And I think part of that stems from the fact that in the final decision-making process, they kind of go around the table and they say go or no go.
Yeah.
And it's all the ally leaders. And several of them say no go. Several say it's not worth it. And I think he was aware that if it failed, immediately, the long knives would come out for him.
Yeah.
And so better to own it than to get in a public spat with other military leaders of other countries. But also, I think I'm not a historian. I'm not a World War II historian. I'm not even a historian. But when you read about the preparations, when you read about the level of secrecy, when you read about the fact that once the southernmost barracks, once the troops there knew where they were going, that they surrounded our own troops with barbed wire to keep word from getting out. When you think about the map of the French coastline that was built in the house that they were using as a base, and then the map makers were jailed in the home until after the operation was done. I mean, just the level of planning and scrutiny and secrecy that went into this, and recognizing that it still indeed could have failed. I almost get emotional when I'm rereading it because the weight of the world really rested on these decisions.
Yeah, and it is important. It is extremely admirable that he did say that the blame was all his own. And also, we have to remember that Eisenhower, had not been a combat veteran. So he had a lot of generals who were thinking, this guy hasn't actually been in combat. He's more of an administrator. He's a military politician. He's a coalition builder. He doesn't know what this is like. I should be doing this. Certainly Patton, people like that thought that.
Yeah.
And so it'd be quite easy for them to jump on that fact after D-Day had failed, if it had failed. So I suppose Eisenhower's looking in potentially at literally the end of his career.
He is, and he's aware of that, and he talks about that later. Again, he said, I was the one who picked it out. I knew I couldn't fail except on weather. I was the one who's responsible. If it did fail, and this he said years later to Walter Cronkite, if it did fail, I was going into oblivion anyway. So I might as well take full responsibility.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting.
I mean, it's really so powerful.
And I think there's an important aspect to Eisenhower too, as well, is that he doesn't then, once D-Day succeeds, he doesn't go off and trumpet himself as the D-Day guy publicly. There's no real mention of this in the 52 campaign for president. He downplays or doesn't even trumpet really his own leadership aspect in making it work, but yet he's willing to take the full blame if it doesn't work.
Yeah, and one of the things I was particularly struck by is you see some of these very powerful photos as he sends off the first paratroopers.
Yeah.
They're all in camouflage and he's talking to them, and he loves them. He really does. He loves them. He connects with them emotionally, but he's surprisingly unemotional about the fact that thousands of them are going to die in a best case scenario. He really lays out a plan, and these young people who are well trained, who he respects tremendously, are pawns. And he's laid out a plan where he thinks there will be minimal sacrifice, but he knows there will be some sacrifice. So I think part of why he doesn't really trumpet it is because, even in the best case scenario, there were terrible, terrible losses. And then, again, we talked earlier in the podcast about not creating alternative histories. But at the end of this chapter, I do probe a couple historians to say, okay, what happens if D-Day fails?
Hmm.
how does the rest of the war play out? And it's really interesting. Some historians say the Soviets might have won the war single-handedly, in which case by 1946, as one of them said, we may have well have seen the Soviet hammer and sickle flying, not simply in Poland, but in West Germany and some of the Benelux countries in France. Another historian says, like, would it have meant actually there had to be a negotiated end to the war, and what would Europe look like there? And so that is the speculative history that's really fascinating. But none of those outcomes, none of the speculation from the ones that are bullish on the Soviet Union winning the war solo, or America having to come up through the South, through Italy, and potentially have a negotiated surrender, none of them are good.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it doesn't matter how much the Allies are bombing Germany into oblivion on the ground. It does take an invasion from the East and an invasion from the West to win.
And these don't even begin to think about, a major failure like that. What does it do for politics in America? Does FDR get reelected?
The isolationists could say we were right.
We were right. Look at this. We've just lost, 50,000 of our young men in one fell swoop. I love this speech because of what it says about leadership and taking responsibility. I love it because I think it's an interesting tool of leadership that leaders who trumpet success need to consider failure. And I love it because it's not rhetorical, it's factual, it's direct, it's terse. I think it speaks to the type of leader Eisenhower was. In the writing of the book, I didn't know a ton about Eisenhower, but I really came to admire him.
Yes, well, historians have admired him more and more as the decades go on. Well, I don't want to go on too long about the book because I would just talk about every chapter and then people wouldn't read it. And they need to read it because of the detail, frankly, that you go into, which is so interesting and so important. This isn't just a newspaper report or a New Yorker essay just about this sort of process. You really do get into the weeds in a good way. And I think that's why it's vital reading.
Well, I will say one thing, which is, initially when I envisioned this book, I thought, oh, I found these speeches in the archives. They're interesting. I'll just slap them on paper and publish them. And then I realized the real fun of the book was recreating these chapters of history, really seeing where history rested on a razor's edge, seeing what decisions led to what outcomes. So instead of this being a book about speeches, the speeches become kind of the coda to the recreation of the chapters of history. And so that was really fun for me to do, and kind of a surprise for me. The other thing I will say, for those of your listeners who enjoy audiobooks, we had a ton of fun with the audiobook. It almost sounds like a podcast. We pull up archival audio where we have it.
Yeah.
We have actors reading for some of the undelivered speeches. So it was fun to cast actors and say, I don't know, this Kennedy sounds a little British to me, and try to get someone else. So the audiobook is a fun listen as well.
Well, you know what we'll do? We'll put both versions on the blog post because I didn't know that. In fact, as soon as we get off the line, I'm going to download the audiobook. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Jeff, for coming on the show. This is an unmissable history, and I'm so glad you wrote it.
Well, it's such a pleasure to join you and a pleasure for us to be connected on this.
Buzzkillers, please go to the Buzzkill bookshelf on the blog post for this episode. It's there. Get it either in hard copy or audiobook form. Please go to professorbuzzkill.com and sign up for all the free stuff we have. Please rate and review us on iTunes and Apple Podcasts and all those places. It really does make a big difference. But we will talk to all of you out there next week.